morning. Let's see if I can follow it up now. Okay, so I want to kind of take what we've been talking about a lot over the over the last few hours and kind of give it a little bit of shape in terms of what is chain abstraction and its composition. So I won't talk too much about explaining the problem of chain abstraction. I have some slides here, but I'll be pretty fast with that. But more so what I really want to highlight here is how is chain abstraction composed? So we know what the kind of goal is here, we know what the problem that we're solving, but what does chain abstraction look like on an implementation level, especially how do these different projects actually fit in together? There's a lot of projects building for chain abstraction. Ourselves at Particle Network included, Octo, Socket, NEAR, Agoric. How do they actually fit together? Are these all trying to solve the same problem, kind of competing with one another, or is it more of a synergistic collaborative framework? This is what I'm going to be talking about over the next few minutes. So as a quick introduction, my name is Ethan, although I go by the alias Tabasco. I lead developer relations at Particle Network. As I'll get into a little bit later, at Particle Network, we're building something called universal accounts. This essentially allows you as a user to have one address and one balance that you can use across the entire ecosystem. So you don't need a bridge or manage multiple different wallets or do anything like this. You simply have one interface for everything. You can use your MetaMask account to basically interact with any application across any chain without the need to bridge. So first of all, what I want to do is just very briefly talk about kind of, why this stack needs to exist, why chain abstraction needs to exist. So what I want to do is start with some context as to the current state of UX in the ecosystem. I think people sometimes overblow the issues of user experience. I think user experience actually is really good in the context of one application. So if you're in the silo of a specific application, user experience has like a capacity to be amazing actually and very Web 2-like. You have things like social logins and session keys and account abstraction, which are already live, especially within the EVM ecosystem, where you can pretty easily today create an application that is essentially removed from a lot of the complexities associated with blockchain. So you can do things like pop-up-less transactions and gasless transactions and onboarding with your Google account and stuff like this. So this is totally possible today. But the issue, of course, as we've been talking about at the conference throughout today, is that this UX breaks down at a multi-chain level. So this means that whenever I'm doing things across chains and I want to move from this initial application that I onboard into onto an application B on chain B from application A on chain A, this is where this user experience becomes virtually unusable for end users. Because now I need to not only cognitively manage multiple balances on each chain, so I have to say, okay, I have 10 ETH on Ethereum, I have 10 ETH on Base, and then I have some funds on Polygon, and then how do I get these between these chains? Is that if I do want to get these funds between chains, I need to now bridge, which is a typically complicated thing. It's something that could be expensive or slow or not very secure. So this is an issue that users face today, which is really at a larger multi-chain level. User experience is virtually unusable, and this problem actually grows stronger now because as an industry, we're moving towards this idea of a roll-up-centric future, a modular approach to scaling, where applications move to chains, and we see more roll-ups pop up every single day. So this fragmentation and this issue of multi-chain user experience becomes more of an issue as we kind of progress down this roll-up-centric roadmap. So of course, the way that we fix this is with chain abstraction, which we've talked a lot about today. But what is chain abstraction actually defined as? This is sort of a buzzword today. So how can you understand chain abstraction at a practical level? So we produced an article diving into this at Particle over the past few months, which we try to basically give chain abstraction a more formal definition and understanding of what it actually means, in which we basically attach this definition of chain abstraction, which is that chain abstraction is a user experience exempt from the manual processes required to interact with multiple chains, which just simply means bridging and managing multiple balances and things of this nature. This is essentially what chain abstraction is, and this is what it aims to do, and this is actually achieved by multiple different kind of interoperable solutions, which I'll get to in just a moment. First of all, if you're interested in the definition of chain abstraction, this is an article that we, like I mentioned, have been pushing quite a bit. It's been kind of like our way of removing a lot of the buzzwordy nature from chain abstraction, which you can scan on the QR code right there. So of course, with chain abstraction, with the solution, as I'll kind of just touch on very briefly, is that chains become invisible to end users. So there's kind of two halves of impact that chain abstraction has to the ecosystem. The first is on the actual user experience. So what happens to end users? Chains become invisible. They can interact with applications across every blockchain with a single balance and ideally a single point of interaction. So I can use my MetaMask for every application across every chain. I don't really need to worry about downloading multiple wallets or bridging and things like this. So this is the user experience part of chain abstraction. But chain abstraction has a deeper impact, especially at the developer level. So developers can create this idea of chain agnostic applications, which is actually something that is a relatively new concept in the ecosystem. We talked a little bit about this on the panel this morning, which is that ideally in a chain abstracted future, applications are not going to be bound by any single blockchain. And actually, applications will compose and interact across, 10, 15, 20 different blockchains simultaneously. So whenever I do a transaction, this can exist across multiple different ecosystems, multiple different blockchains. And this is a future where we have applications agnostic to any specific blockchain, freed from the confines of any specific blockchain. So this is quite exciting. I think another kind of benefit of chain abstraction that's perhaps more impactful than the kind of surface level user experience benefits. Okay, so the kind of core idea here is understanding this. We know what chain abstraction is, we know how chain abstraction is defined, we get why chain abstraction is needed, but there's so many projects building for chain abstraction. How are they actually layered together? How do they exist simultaneously? Do they exist simultaneously? So this is also a question that we wanted to answer at Particle over the past few months. Similarly to the definition, we found that the vertical had kind of this problem of lacking collaboration. So a lot of projects were trying to solve the entire problem, and there really wasn't much granularity in terms of how we look at chain abstraction and how the stack looks like. So this is where the layered approach comes in. Before the layered approach, you had things like the cake framework, which I'll get into. But the most important kind of idea behind the layered approach to chain abstraction is that chain abstraction is not an inherently competitive vertical. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not a one winner is going to do chain abstraction, then we're done with it. Then we've kind of completed the goal here. Chain abstraction is actually collaborative, and I think that this kind of embodies a big part of the modular thesis, which is kind of this idea of modularism, not maximalism, which I think actually the chain abstraction vertical is a good example of in terms of its kind of market composition. So like I mentioned, one of the early implementations of this sort of like collaborative idea to chain abstraction is the cake framework. This is done by frontier researcher One Balance, who was also present earlier today. And essentially saying like, here are the technologies, the granular technologies that exist to kind of like, be a part of chain abstraction. These are the technologies that make up chain abstraction. Intense, account abstraction, shared sequencers, pre-confirmation, stuff like this. These are more granular technologies that enable the kind of chain abstraction implementations that you see today, like the particle network and Agoric and stuff like this. So this is where layered chain abstraction comes in. Layered chain abstraction exists to basically look at the entire chain abstraction landscape and the projects building within it specifically and say, how do these projects actually fit together on a more collaborative basis? How is chain abstraction actually implemented in a way that isn't just one project to do all chain abstraction? This is where you get layers of chain abstraction. So you can really understand the vertical in 3 key layers and 3 key kind of components that work together to create what is a full chain abstracted experience. Each one of these layers can be used individually to create a better user experience, but complete chain abstraction needs to happen through the simultaneous usage of blockchain level chain abstraction, account level chain abstraction, and application level chain abstraction. Blockchain level chain abstraction is things like Polygon ag layer, right? So proof aggregation, kind of like roll up collectives, things like this, or Optimism superchain, similar, chain collectives. Even things like, you have things like ZK Sync elastic chains, or Optimism orbit, or things like this, even NodeKit for like sequencing and whatnot. So this is like the blockchain level chain abstraction. It's intrinsic interoperability between blockchains. Below this, you have account level chain abstraction. So actually bringing chain abstraction to user accounts. How do users interact with the ecosystem through a means that is agnostic to any specific blockchain? How do they use One Balance across chains? This is what account level chain abstraction aims to solve. This is the more user experience part of this. This is what I mentioned earlier in terms of how does chain abstraction actually affect the UX? This is through account level chain abstraction. This is what we're building at Particle Network. Application level chain abstraction is more of the developer facing impacts. This is what I also mentioned a moment ago. How does chain abstraction actually affect developers and create a chain agnostic experience where they are, they have the ability to compose and kind of exist simultaneously across multiple different blockchains without being kind of confined to one or a few. This is things like Agoric, Socket, and Skip, for example. So this is kind of like how you can understand the vertical. It's this kind of interoperable usage of account level chain abstraction, blockchain level chain abstraction, and application level chain abstraction. This is how you get the true benefits of chain abstraction. You get the user experience benefits through the means of things like universal accounts, so One Balance applicable across all blockchains, and you get the developer experience benefits for things like Socket and Agoric, which allow developers to compose across the entire ecosystem. So as an example, I want to take the last kind of few minutes I have here and talk about kind of exemplifying account level chain abstraction through the means of universal accounts, which I talked about a moment ago. But essentially, universal accounts kind of look at the account abstraction landscape. Dean mentioned this a little bit on the last fireside chat there, which is that a part of chain abstraction is account abstraction, especially within the EVM ecosystem. So we looked at account abstraction and said, well, accounts are good interfaces actually to remove multiple blockchains from the user experience and to remove the kind of processes of interacting with these multiple blockchains. But by default, actually, account abstraction is not very easy to apply across the multi-chain ecosystem because With account abstraction, you're using contracts as user interaction. You're using contracts as user accounts. This means that if I update the contract on chain A and I want to go to chain B, then that contract is different than it was on chain A. And the state of this account is very fragmented, especially if you start getting the updates and things like this. So account abstraction is intrinsically difficult to get right across multiple chains. And of course, it suffers from the same problem that EOAs do, in that your balances are fragmented and your account state is fragmented across these blockchains. So universal accounts basically look at the account abstraction model and say there's benefits to account abstraction. There's a lot of things that are a part of the experience here that are important, social recovery and gasless transactions, et cetera, and bundled transactions, things like this. But they suffer from this multi-chain problem. So how do we fix this, and how do we create chain abstraction at the user level and fix the issues of account abstraction at the same time? This is where universal accounts come in and essentially allow, as a user, you to have, like I mentioned, one balance that's usable everywhere. And actually this exists within a smart account, or kind of like an upgraded smart account, that also has unified state across all chains. So the state of your smart account is the same regardless of the chain that you're using. There is no fragmentation. If I update the smart account on chain A, it'll exist the same on chain B, C, D, et cetera. There's no differentiation here. And as a user, if I want to interact across chain A, B, C, and D, I have my balance. If I have 10 USDC on chain A, and 10 USDC on chain B, and 10 USDC on chain C, I have 30 USDC, and I can use this anywhere I want. There's no distinction here to end users, at least by default. So this is important. This means that for users, they can go to any application, even if the application isn't purpose-built for chain abstraction, and use an account that allows them to really compose and exist across the ecosystem without really needing to pay mind to the details of individual blockchains. So more granularly, I won't get into too many of the details here, but essentially we achieve this through a few different things. The first being universal liquidity, which is essentially the technology that allows users to access their funds across any blockchain and sort of consolidate funds across chains. And you have universal gas, which basically allows users to, through the means of the smart account, pay for gas fees with any token. So I can do a transaction on Polygon using ETH from Ethereum and pay for gas fees with USDC on Solana. This is all possible, and it's actually already live on testnet. This is what universal gas does. And then we actually coordinate all of this and sort of like basically keep track of account state through a Cosmos blockchain. So we have a Cosmos app chain. It's very much in the background, and it essentially allows us to keep track of and essentially coordinate actors across the sort of like intent-centric filler-like system that allows us to then move funds across chains. So it gets a little more complicated than this, but this is essentially the kind of composition of universal accounts. This is what enables this user experience of essentially having one account, one balance for any chain. That's about it. We are building a lot in the chain abstraction space. Like I said, we also do a lot of content and articles about the chain abstraction stack, the chain abstraction definition, things like this. I'd definitely recommend learning a little bit more about that. You can go to particle.network or blog.particle.network and follow us on Twitter at particle and TWRK. It's a great event. It's been awesome so far, and thank you for having me.